Hello everyone, this is Anuj from Oges and I would like to welcome you all to the third Oges webinar on women in oil and gas industry. Today's webinar is an effort to throw some light on the oil and gas industry demographics and the issues faced by women in the industry. Now, Oges, as you know, is the most preferred platform for knowledge sharing, where you can get the solution to your queries in any domain directly from the experts. Thank you all for your kind support so far. Now, I would like to introduce you to our esteemed speaker today, Dr. Eve Sprunt, who did her PhD in geophysics from Stanford University. Doctor Eve was the founder of Core Analysts and also the president of SPE in the year 2006. She is also the author of the book A Guide for Dual Career Couples Rewriting the Rules, published by Prager Publications and is now available on Amazon as well. I would like to thank Dr. Eve for her time and would request her to take the mic and carry on with the webinar from here. Dr. Eve.
Thank you, Anuj. Can we advance to the next slide? Thank you. I've got a lot of material I want to cover today, starting out with what the problems are facing women in the petroleum industry at this time, moving on to some specific examples, providing some advice on what you can do for yourself, and also providing my vision of what I would like to see in the future. Next slide, please. So women face many problems. One is bias, and bias can come in many forms, and women may face more than one form of bias. There's often bias against women as well as members of various demographic groups. Another serious issue in the workplace is bullying, and bullying tends to become more of a problem when jobs are scarce, as at the present time. So I will be providing some information on how you can deal with bullying and also what employers should do about bullying. I'm going to address some cultural and lifestyle issues that can create conflict with both supervisors and with coworkers. Another key issue is that when there are programs to benefit women, this can also create resentment from men who think that women are doing fine, even though women don't think they're doing well, and that these programs create a situation of reverse discrimination against the men. Another issue is that with more and more women working, there's another hidden change in the workplace, in that instead of having a work environment dominated by people who are the sole or dominant earner in their family, we have a growing number of households that depend on two incomes, and that creates a different lifestyle. And that in turn leads to issues that if women are contributing a large, or in some cases half or more, of the household income, how household responsibilities and child rearing can be more equally shared. Next slide, please. In terms of data showing the increasing number of women in the industry, it's relatively rare. This data comes from the membership of the Society of Exploration Geophysicists, and it's a snapshot in time but the percentage of women in different age ranges in effect mirrors the gradual increase of women in the workforce. So that you can see in the older age groups, older than 45 and up to and above retirement age, that there are relatively few women, less than 10%. Whereas now, when you get to the youngest group, those 18 to 24, about a third of the workforce is now female. And as I mentioned, not only do we now have a workforce that's a larger percentage female, but that also that means we have far more people who are part of a couple where both are working to support the family. The other issue is that the increase of women in the workforce varies around the world. So the experiences women have in different countries may vary distinctly depending upon the percentage of women in the workplace. Next slide, please. One of the issues is employers often focus on getting more women working. So there are many efforts to encourage women to study and get degrees in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. There are enhanced recruiting programs for early career women. But my focus is really on mid-career attrition. So what I'm going to be talking about today are factors that discourage women who've in effect gone to the trouble to become fully qualified to work in technical disciplines, but find that they're not advancing and drop out mid-career. And so this is about strategies and tactics to make women more successful in their careers. Next, please. We hear a lot about work-life balance, and frequently when someone decides to drop out, the excuse is that they weren't happy with their work-life balance. But balance by its very nature means that both sides, both the opportunity and what you get for it, have equal weight. So it's pain, gain, risk, reward. And if women are not getting the opportunities and the rewards that they want, then the pain does not seem worthwhile. So in looking at all these things, it's that aspect of what's the problem, what's the reward, what's going wrong here. Next slide, please. The key factor that motivates people is opportunity. And conversely, people most often leave jobs because they feel have insufficient opportunity. These results came out in a series of surveys that I led that together gathered more than 10,000 responses. At the bottom of the slides, I'll often be giving a reference to one of the technical papers from which the data came. Next, please. So mid-career frustration, what causes it? Often when women start out, they think, the sky's the limit, that the problems have been solved, and that their career is going along fine. And then often at about the same time they're starting to settle down, have a family, they find that they're no longer getting the promotions that they hope to get. And they're faced with a lack of opportunity. Companies talk about getting broadening opportunities through lateral assignments, but after a series of lateral assignments, it can become very clear that you're not moving upward. Also, women also often end up in staff as opposed to managerial roles, and it can be difficult to break out of that. At the same time, since women are taking on more responsibilities at home, they feel a lack of flexibility. So all these add up to the mid-career frustration that can be voiced in terms of work-life balance. Next slide, please. When we surveyed people, particularly women who'd left the petroleum industry, asking them why they'd left, interestingly, childcare issues were not among the top 5 reasons why women quit. It's very politically correct if you're sick and tired of where you're working and you want to leave, to say, I'm leaving for family reasons. I want to spend more time with my children, with my family. You're not saying anything negative about your employer. But in our survey, people were anonymous. They weren't risking breaking any relationships and could be more honest. And what came out was that the top reason people left was for more meaningful work and insufficient opportunity. The third reason in the top ones was to work in a location they liked better. So all this says that the problem is not necessarily on the home side, but often on the opportunities women have at work. Next, please. In the surveys, not only did we look at the most significant reasons people gave, but also the differences between the responses of men and women to try to understand the difference in experience men and women were having. So when we looked at the reasons for changing employers between men and women under the age of 40, one of the things that really came out was that women report having more conflict, both with their supervisors and with their coworkers. It's often said that people don't leave companies, they leave bosses. Women also reference lack of a flexible work schedule and following their partner. So those are showing where the burden is greater on women than on men. Whereas if you look at men's issues, it's where they're feeling they're not getting enough recognition and often to be self-employed. Next slide, please. When we look at the issues of conflict, the question is, why are women reporting conflict? One of the things that a lot has been written about is the fact that women often feel that when they speak up, they're not heard, or that they may be trying to talk about an idea and convince people they have a wonderful idea, and it's simply not accepted until a man picks it up, thinks it's his idea, and then everyone attributes the idea to the man instead of the woman who initiated it. One of the factors that comes into this that we also saw in the survey is that when asked a question in terms of what were the major factors, women tended to pick many more factors than men did. So when women talk about an issue, they're trying to provide the context that they think is relevant, which often involves many more factors than what a man thinks is relevant. This, in fact, is one of the reasons why diversity is of value. Women may pick up things that men may overlook. But in terms of the communications in business, men like you to get to the point right then, give them an example, and think that women are wasting their time with all this extra context and rambling. Another issue is that when there are very few people in a work location, women can feel very isolated and take everything personally. They don't have someone to talk to find out how people are treated in general, and they feel as if it's all them. Also, their lifestyle differences in that a significant fraction of men still have a spouse who stays home and takes care of all the logistics. And even if they don't, their boss, if they're older and male, may assume that they do, whereas women and a growing fraction of men are juggling an existence where they have significant responsibilities both at home and at work. Another factor is that when women have children, often they stop advancing and, in effect, lose income relative to men, whereas when men have children, they often get promoted and raises. And again, there's issues of men resenting preferential treatment for women, and that whenever there's preferential treatment for any group, that sort of reinforces the idea that that group is not as good. Next slide, please. So one of the factors that happens is that women fall off the fast track. And this can happen because they lose a sponsor as you move up in an organization. Who gets the desired roles often is determined by who has a strong sponsor, who's willing to back them. For many reasons, it can be more difficult for a woman to get a sponsor. It can be riskier for a man to sponsor a woman and promote her. The conflict, both with supervisors and coworkers, people don't see those whose behavior provokes conflict as being a future leader. The communications issues, that they're not viewed as communicating in an executive manner. Another big one is that often if women are part of a dual career couple, they're unwilling to relocate. And in many multinational companies, willingness to relocate is a requirement for being on the fast track. It may not be stated explicitly, but it is often there. And there still is a motherhood penalty associated with that, perceptions about dedication to their career. Next slide, please. We also have a situation where around the world this can vary in terms of shifting barriers to women's advancement. So what the problems are vary around the world. Some countries still have explicit gender restrictions. It's legal to pay women less for the same work, different work rules for women. Sometimes the work rules are supposedly to protect women, but that they can end up being career limiting. Other places we've moved on to subtle or unconscious bias. In particular, unconscious bias can be that you can have somebody who feels that they're supporting women, but that they wouldn't want one of their female employees doing something they wouldn't want their own daughter doing. So when women are not allowed to take risks, to go to perhaps a dangerous location or go out in the field, something that their boss thinks could be risky, that can end up being career limiting. There's the other factor that people often hire and promote in their own image. And so an older man may look at a younger man and say, gee, he's just like me at that age, and empathize with them more. Next slide, please. One factor that's quite well known is resume bias. There have been studies done in multiple disciplines where basically an identical resume is put together, and with different groups, the only thing that's switched is the gender of the name on that resume. And sadly, both men and women tend to give a lower ranking and view as less qualified the resume with a female name attached. So that, this in effect comes up every time a woman is applying for a position, even within a company, whether or not when she's a candidate for promotion. And each little slight on that, each little discount on the gender factor over the course of a career has a large cumulative effort. In one very interesting example where blind auditions were possible was in orchestras, major orchestras were overwhelmingly male. But when they started to do blind auditions where they had a screen, where nobody could see who was playing, and they went so far as to have the musicians take off their shoes so that no one could hear high heels, only then did the percentage of musicians who were female in these major orchestras start increasing significantly. Unfortunately, that's not possible in our industry, and that once you're working for a company, it's also impossible to have in effect these blind auditions. So women don't get as much credit for their accomplishments as men would get for an equivalent accomplishment. Next slide, please. I mentioned bullying, and that can be a significant problem. What you're looking at in this slide is the blue curve is oil price adjusted for inflation, and the red curve is employment in the U.S. What you can see there, and it's generally reflected around the world, is that with a time lag, employment mimics the oil price curve. What that means is that in times of declining or low oil prices, it can be much more difficult to get another position. So if someone has an unpleasant supervisor or coworker who is bullying them, they will put up with it because they don't think they can get another job. And bullying is a very self-destructive process because it undermines a person's self-esteem. Next slide, please. So what can you do about bullying? When jobs are scarce as they are at the present time. One thing is just putting a name on it can be very important, because what a bully does is he doesn't need to know what you're insecure about. The bully just needs to make you feel insecure, and then your insecurity undermines your own self-esteem, and it's a downward spiral. So you need to break the cycle. And the quicker you recognize that the problem is not with your performance or your behavior, but that the person that you're dealing with is a bully, the better off you are. Because then you can look at the problem and say, it's not me, I'm dealing with a bully. It can be very difficult to get help if the bully is your supervisor or a favorite of your supervisor. They will not necessarily want to discipline them. So if you can, you need to get out of the chain of command to get help. Some organizations have ombuds programs you can go to, or a way to get around. While there are plenty of bullies out there and you need to learn to deal with them, in a bad situation, you really want to get away from the bully if you can. It helps a lot to have confidence that you can speak to about your problems both inside and outside your organization. People outside your organization may not understand your employer's dynamics well enough to give you really good advice, which someone inside can. And you need to create a support network for yourself, both inside and outside your company. Next slide, please. So when times are hard, and actually at all times, you need a safety net. But it's not something that you build overnight. It's something that you build gradually over time, and you have to be constantly maintaining, because it's easily broken and disrupted. Next slide, please. So how do you go about networking? One way to look at it is within networks, you never know when you're going to need a favor from someone. And so one practice to do is often it can be relatively easy to do something that helps someone else a great deal. And so in a sense, you want to pay it forward by always helping other people when you can. A great way to network is to join one or more relevant professional societies. The advantage of a professional society, particularly if you're active, if all you do is join and just sit in meetings, you don't get nearly as much as if you volunteer and are active. When you're active, your fellow volunteers, who are often the most influential people, can see you demonstrating your abilities. You can also get opportunities to develop and apply skills that you may not have the opportunity to use at work. There are also women's groups that can be very beneficial in terms of having a chance to discuss issues of concern with you. Sheryl Sandberg, in her book Lean In, talks about Lean In circles. Many professional societies have women's groups. The Society of Exploration Geophysicists has a very active women's network committee. SPE is forming one. There are also professional societies that are specifically about women's issues, including the Society of Women Engineers and the Association for Women in Science. The other thing in terms of networking is keep your LinkedIn profile up to date. Keep your resume up to date. The time to capture accomplishments is right when they happen, when you're feeling good about things. When you've lost a job or you desperately need to find a job, you're not in the right frame of mind to create an upbeat, positive resume. So you want to keep that up to date, and you want to continuously work on it. LinkedIn is a favorite site for recruiters, and even in bad times, recruiters are out there looking for people with specific skills. So it's a very good tool. When it comes time to look for a job, your network is your biggest advantage. Next slide, please. So one of the points I want to make is that when I started working, I thought I could do it all. It was the sort of superwoman approach that you could be a great technical professional, you could be a wonderful mother, a fabulous cook, a great wife, and the view was, that you were taking on these extra roles, and it wasn't so much how the man's role was changing as well. The picture there is of my son and his wife. They're both PhD engineers. They're not in the petroleum industry, but they both work full-time, and my first granddaughter. And it was really by looking at them and other younger people that I saw how, in effect, the relationship was evolving, and how, in effect, dual career couples that were both equal earners were adapting, and that men were playing a larger role in many things that had traditionally been primarily women's responsibility, when the man's venue was to go out and work for wages, and a woman did the unpaid work at home. Next slide, please. So to understand this issue of dual career couples, I worked with both the Society of Petroleum Engineers and the Society of Exploration Geophysicists, conducting a series of surveys. This is showing data from one with the Society of Petroleum Engineers. What you're looking at is the percentage of people in different age ranges who said that they were part of a dual career couple. We're not interviewing or getting responses from both parts of a couple, just from the society members. And since there are far more men who are members of SPE than women, and far more men in the petroleum industry, what you see is that women are much more likely in all age groups to be part of a dual career couple than men are. They're much less likely to have a stay-at-home partner who is providing full-time support. The other thing that's very important to look at in this graph is when you look at the age groups from 25 through 55, you can see that there's a steady increase through the younger groups of men who are part of a dual career couple, such that in the 25 to 29-year-old age group, it's about the same percentage of men and women are part of a dual career couple. For the younger group, there's a huge difference, and one can speculate on what the reason is for that. Women often partner with an older man. Another possibility is that women think that there's more commitment there sooner than men do. But if you look at that main group, you can see a very distinct trend that younger men are much more likely to be part of a dual career couple. Next slide, please. In understanding how dual career couples are changing the culture, an important thing to look at is to follow the money. So one of the other things I did was specifically amongst those who said that they were dual career couples is look at those who are equal earners. And this is some data from the Society of Exploration Geophysicists study showing the percentage of people in different age ranges who said that they contributed nearly equally, 40 to 60% of the household income. And what you can see is that women, almost always, 30% or more of the women across the age ranges were in equal earners, where again, as in the previous slide, there's a trend as you go from men in their 50s down to younger men for them to be more likely to be part of a dual career couple. Next slide, please. One question comes up is, how does this vary around the world? And in the Society of Petroleum Engineers study, we could pull out where people worked around the world. And what you can see is the purple line are people in Europe. So people in Europe are among the ones with the highest percentage of those in equal earner households, followed by people in North America and also in Australia and New Zealand. The pale blue curve, if you look at the 30 to 34-year-old age range that comes in right below, kind of below that, peaking at about 30%, is for the former Soviet Union. And I recently was on a lecture tour that took me to Aktau and Astana in Kazakhstan. And there are indeed many young professionals, female and male, who are part of dual career couples there. Traveling around the world as SP president and on other business, I've met dual career couples all around the world, whether in Angola or Indonesia. So the percentage varies around the world, but it's increasing in many places, sometimes dramatically so, as in some of the former Soviet Union countries like Kazakhstan. Next slide, please. So why are dual career couples, so different? And I view this as a form of invisible diversity. When you have a household where there's a single breadwinner, then everything focuses on protecting that income. The partner can provide a great deal of support. If the breadwinner is transferred, the wife, as it generally was, can stay behind with the children, pack up the household, arrange all the logistics, get everything moved, whereas the single breadwinner is free to go on to the next location on very short notice. With a stay-at-home partner, the breadwinner can also travel on short notice and work extended hours on very little notice. When you have equal earners, particularly if they have young children, there are a great deal of logistics because young children have to be watched, somebody has to be tending them. In terms of how you balance that, trade-offs, if one person has been offered a transfer, but that will cost the other person their job, or they'll have to live separately, the economics are very different in terms of whether or not it makes sense to accept the relocation. So all this drives a different lifestyle and priorities. And when people have different lifestyles and priorities, that can lead to misunderstanding and friction, which is a problem because senior management is older and primarily composed of dominant earners. Next, please. One thing that comes up is in many countries, there are laws against discrimination against women, but there are no rules against discrimination of members of dual career couples. And so questions that if they were gender related would be illegal are perfectly legal with regard to dual career couples and can result in considerable discrimination. And since women are more likely to be part of these couples, adversely impacts women. Next slide, please. So one thing that came up, and I've had conversations with a lot of managers who feel that to make the best use of their resources, they need to know whether or not an individual considers their career to be more important than that of their partner. What you can see in this table is at the present time when we asked, when we were saying, whose career do you consider to be more important right now? Of those who are equal earners, 86% of the women and 80% of the men said that both careers were equally important. Of all women, 76% said both careers were equally important. But when you look at all dual career men, that drops to 58%. This shows that a very large fraction of dual career couples consider both careers to be equally important. Next, please. One thing that comes up that kind of shows the prejudice and reveals what management is thinking is who gets asked the question about whose career has priority. So women are more likely to be asked than equivalent men. If they have children, women are more likely to be asked. And if they both partners work for the same employer, women are much more likely, again, to be asked. So this points up some of the problems with working for the same employer and the fact that women are under more scrutiny than men are about the relative priority of their career. Next slide. So the managerial perspective is that it's absolutely ludicrous to have the concept that two careers can be equally important. There are some examples of some very high-powered executives. Sheryl Sandberg, before the tragic death of her husband, was part of a dual-career couple. But many managers think that you just can't do it, that, as they say, one career must lead and the other follow. And they're not willing to entertain or waste resources on a woman who says, well, both careers are equally important. Going even further than that, for executives, some management believes that not only must must somebody's career take precedence, but they want, in effect, what I call the 2-for-1 deal. They want a spouse providing full-time support so that the employee can devote all of their time and attention to their job. Next slide, please. You might think that that's a great deal for the company, if they can get somebody who's totally devoted to their job. The problem is that if you look at the demographics, they suggest that more and more of the workforce will be part of a dual career couple. And if you have management that doesn't understand the lifestyle and the priorities of members of dual career couples, you'll have more conflict and problems. There are studies that show that this is indeed the case. And in our surveys, when we looked at men under the age of 40, dual career couple men were more likely to quit because of working too many hours or conflict with their boss than other men who left for better pay and benefits. And if you look at it, it makes sense. If you're part of a dual career couple, a lot of that is making sure that both incomes are protected. And just getting more income for one person, if it jeopardizes the income of the other, does not net improve the family's financial situation. Next slide, please. So one of the key issues for those couples who are in a position to share an employer is whether or not it's a good idea. And there are very strong opinions on this subject. The main reason people like sharing an employer is to coordinate relocation, especially international relocation, where it can be extremely difficult to get work permits for the trailing partner if they're not both working for the same company. The most important reason why people don't want to work for the same employer is that when you work for separate employers, you can manage your communications and in effect bluff, pretend that both careers are, that your career has the lead to each person's employer. But when you both work for the same employer, what happens is you're not compared to your entire peer group, you're compared to each other. And the employer tends to pick a winner, the one whose career they think is more important, even if you're both very strong players. The other negative that came up, and this survey was conducted in 2013, before the oil price crashed, is job security. We didn't even ask a question about job security, but in the comment fields, so many people commented on job security as a factor. It was clearly a key issue. Often the words were the same: too many eggs in one basket, as in, if the company runs into financial difficulty, both people in a couple may end up losing their job at the same time. Next slide, please. One of the big stressors for women and for dual career couples is child rearing. And that's a picture of my son with my first granddaughter there. And what you can see is he's holding a brand new infant. And many men, particularly of older generations, would be absolutely terrified to do that. But it highlights one thing that's very important for women, which is paternity leave. Women really need to support paternity leave because child rearing is a long-term project. And the best way to get men to be co-parents is to get them involved early and used to doing, in effect, the heavy lifting of child rearing. And there are many studies that show if fathers take paternity leave, they're more likely to get involved. The other aspect is that even if the government, as opposed to an employer, is picking up the cost of maternity leave, there's still the disruption of women leaving work for a period of time. And so if both parents take parental leave, it reduces the difference between hiring a young woman or a young man of child rearing age. Also, flexible work arrangements should not be viewed as gender related because childcare activities should be shared. And beyond that, they shouldn't even be limited to parents because everyone should have equal access to remove the stigma of making use of them. Because often companies may have flexible work arrangements listed as being available, but no one is willing to make use of them. Next slide, please. How do you help yourself? A key thing here is to understand some of the subtle discrimination out there and to communicate your priorities strategically. You may not be willing to relocate, but if you say that you will flat out not relocate, you will never know what opportunities you might be offered. And as in many things, the sacrifice you're willing to make may depend upon what the opportunities are. And if you say you're not willing to relocate, even if you can get a lot of experiences where you are and advance, those will not be given to you. They'll be given to someone else that the company feels is more serious about their career and has greater potential because they're willing to move. Relocation is particularly important in multinational companies, both service and operators. Another issue is constantly working on your network, making sure that you keep in contact with people and that you help other people and they in turn will help you. As a woman, given the resume bias issues, you need to be very careful about documenting your competencies and your achievements. If you have an opportunity to write a report, to write an article, that attaches your name to the accomplishment, whereas if you leave it to someone else, you may not get the credit you deserve. Whenever possible, you should put a financial value on your achievements. This is not only in things you write, but also in your resume. You should also negotiate with your employer and also with your partner. You shouldn't just assume that you're going to have to do certain things. If you're contributing about half of the household income, then the household and child rearing should be more evenly divided. You also need to negotiate to try to get the flexibility that you need. And the way I see it, as we have more and more technologies, we really should be offering more flexibility in many ways. Next slide, please. So in terms of what employers can do to improve, there's issues about tolerance for bias and bullying. It's often looked the other way. But companies can have ombuds programs, and make it a lot clearer that there's not a tolerance for this kind of behavior. Independent contacts for employees to report concerns. The other aspect is greater transparency to do with compensation. Compensation may not necessarily be tied to job titles. And also the issue in terms of compensation, in terms of looking at it and seeing how the percentage of women at different levels of compensation can reveal where, in effect, the barriers are to women's advancement. Next, please. What gets measured gets attention, and that's where improvements come. So we need a lot more monitoring of barriers to women's advancement on a regular basis so we can see where the bottlenecks are and to address these points. Because with the subtle discrimination, often it's an issue not particularly in large companies, large multinational companies, of whether or not within a pay grade, if women are fairly compensated, but whether or not they're in the right pay grade. We need to monitor attrition and and see if women are dropping out at certain age ranges, at certain life points. And with relocation, companies, I would like to see them move away from open-ended commitments to offering people opportunities, because then as a couple, you can decide whether or not it's worth it to you as a couple to do what it takes to accept the relocation. And when there's not someone in the full-time homemaker role, more time and support is needed for relocation, and also job search support for the trailing spouse. And as I mentioned before, with modern communication, there are many ways that we can offer people more work flexibility. Next, please. So in terms of a future vision, I'd like to see more gender neutral assessment of performance, which, as I said, even women tend to downrate other women relative to men. That we need more transparency on compensation and promotions. We need to leverage technology, not just for the benefit of employers, but also to allow people to work in new and better ways that lets them make better use of their time and better manage their household responsibilities. And that, when both people are contributing equally, the household responsibilities need to be shared more equally. Next, please. So, unfortunately, I could just kind of skim the surface of many of these issues. My book, A Guide for Dual Career Couples, Rewriting the Rules, gets into much more specific detail of these and other issues and looks at the implications of both the surveys I was involved with and many other aspects of research there. So I think reformatting many women's issues as dual career couple issues repositions it and minimizes men's resentment and makes it worthwhile for them to advocate for the same things that will help women. So with that, I think we have just a couple of minutes for questions. If anyone has a question, if not, if you have something you want to ask me afterwards, please feel free to email me.
Thank you, Dr. Eve. That was an extremely remarkable and informative session. So now we move on to our question and answer section. You can ask your questions by clicking the raise hand button on your webinar window, or you can mention them in the chat section as well. Yeah, Dr. Eve, we have a question from Namrata. Okay, Namrata, you're unmuted. Please go ahead with your question.
Hello, Dr. Eve.
Yes?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, hi. That was a very fantastic presentation, and the points were covered very, very well.
Thank you.
My question is, you just mentioned that you should communicate your priorities strategically, and the point is, if they are not heard, as you mentioned in your slides, or they are misunderstood or not understood, what should be done that way in that case? Should we learn the men talk or some other? What's the strategy there?
Well, I think one aspect is understanding, what they're thinking. And if you can get information about, using mentors to say, what are they looking for people who will advance? And even if you don't necessarily fit all those priorities, don't reveal information that you don't have to, that doesn't help you. So it's the aspect like, don't tell them that you will not relocate, that, it can depend upon the circumstances on some of that. Since so much is often said about mentors, I didn't talk a lot about mentors there. But often understanding, what it takes to get somewhere. And, it's like when you're playing a card game, you don't reveal all your cards if you don't have to. So it's thinking, what do I have to do to get there? What should I say or not say when you're talking to them? And it's also negotiating. I think, how you negotiate can depend upon the organization, but that men are much more likely to ask than women are. You asked about the communication style, and I think that that's clearly something where saying it short and concisely can help you a great deal. That if you are the expert, it can become your responsibility to weigh all the factors and then just give a simple recommendation instead of laying out all the factors to make it possible for the other person to come to a conclusion.
Okay. So one last thing. If this mid-career attrition is being monitored in companies and the performances are measured, all this is majorly done by the employers, which has a greater percentage of men there. So to take corrective action, there requires to be a collaborative effort. So how does that can be built into the system?
I think that's it's a very good question there. And often I think that's why people end up switching jobs, because waiting for a system to improve, it may do it, but by the time it improves, you've missed your window of opportunity. And so if there are better opportunities elsewhere, you may be much better off finding a better place and moving around than staying in one location and waiting for it to improve.
Okay. Thank you, doctor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Namrata. If you have any questions, you can please raise your hand from your window. Dr. Eve will be very happy to answer to your queries. In case if you feel to ask the question to Dr. Eve personally, you can mail her on her email ID as mentioned in the last slide of her. Dr. Eve, I think there's no more any questions anymore. So
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Okay, so with this, we come to the end of this session and to the webinar as well. So you can mail Dr. Eve for her questions, And thank you all for attending this webinar. And thank you, Dr. Eve, for your valuable time. Thank you.
Thank you.